Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Clinical Trial Planning in Asia, a Roadmap for Biotech Sponsors. My name is Vicky, and I will be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, with ample time for a question and answer session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and if you do require any assistance, please feel free to contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. And at this point, I would like to thank Novotech, who helped develop the content for this presentation. Established in 1996, Novotech is the largest independent Australia-based CRO. With headquarters in Sydney and operations in 12 countries, Novotech's wide geographic coverage throughout the Asia-Pacific region makes it particularly well-placed as a mid-sized CRO to meet the clinical outsourcing requirements of the biotechnology industry. Novotech's presence on the ground in key countries such as Australia, China, Hong Kong, India, South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand have been instrumental in making a key contribution to a significant number of pivotal U.S. FDA studies. This has, in turn, led to a growing list of now marketed products in fields such as oncology, rheumatology, and neuromuscular diseases. Most recently, Novotech's service offering has come to be recognized by Frost Sullivan as a category winner in the CRO Best Practice Award, an award the company has won for the third time in recent years. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Our first speaker is Dr. John Mahler. Prior to joining Novotech, John was a managing director of IVF Australia and a director of the parent company Virtus Health. John was previously a management consultant with the Boston Consulting Group and Partners in Performance, specializing in supporting private equity transactions and implementing growth and operational improvement initiatives. In addition to his medical qualifications, John also holds a Master of Business Administration degree from the University of Oxford, UK, and a Bachelor of Arts Advanced Logic from University of Canterbury, New Zealand. And our next speaker for today is Kim Wong. Kim heads the Regulatory Affairs function at Novotech, where she oversees Novotech's regulatory affairs consulting services, including planning, management, and preparation of registration applications on behalf of clients to regulatory authorities. She is also responsible for oversight, planning, preparation, and review of ethics committee and regulatory authority submissions for clinical trial approval. Kim has been with Novotech for over 13 years and has a broad scope of knowledge across many facets of clinical research, drug development, pharmacovigilance, and regulatory affairs. Kim holds a medical science degree from the University of Sydney. And our last speaker for today is Chayanant Bunachelio. Chayanant provides management oversight and leadership to a team of experienced SCRAs, CRA, and other support staff. He works closely with the feasibility team and ensures that clinical trials are conducted according to all applicable good clinical practice guidelines, regulatory requirements, standard operating procedures, and the project agreement. Chayanant brings more than 18 years of clinical experience to the role, joining Novotech in 2014. He has previously held senior positions at regional and global CRO and pharmaceutical companies. Chayanant holds a Master's of Science degree, Clinical Pharmacology, and a Bachelor of Pharmacy degree from Chiang Mai University, Thailand. And now, before we do begin, we have a quick poll question for the audience today. And the poll question is, have you or your company conducted a clinical trial in Australia or Asia in the past 2 years? If the audience could please get their answers in, and the answers we have for you are A, yes, or B, no. So I'll just repeat the question again for the audience, and the question is, have you or your company conducted a clinical trial in Australia or Asia in the past 2 years? And this poll question is shortly coming to an end. I will be closing it now and sharing those results with the audience. So majority of the audience, 62%, voted for yes, they have conducted a clinical trial in Australia or Asia in the past 2 years, and then 38% of the audience voted no, they have not conducted a clinical trial in Australia or Asia in the past 2 years. And now, without further ado, I will pass the mic over to our speakers and they may begin when ready.
Thank you, Vicky, and I'd like to welcome all participants to this call. As a further introduction to Novotech, we were established in 1996, and so we turned 20 this year. We have over 300 staff, and we have a physical presence in 12 countries, including 9 countries in Asia.
Hey John, sorry to interject here. Unfortunately, we cannot see your screen right now. If you could just accept the pop-up, and then the audience should be able to view your screen.
I'm afraid I don't have a pop-up.
All right, well, let me just send that to you once again. Perfect, so you may continue with your presentation.
Apologies for that. So we have 9 countries in Asia, and our Greater China operation that you can see on the map includes our offices in Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan. So Novotech's strategy in terms of regional expansion has been to establish a physical office with a senior local country leader and local full-time office-based staff. We've elected to grow organically rather than by acquisition to ensure that the broad skill base and focus on quality that we see as key components of the Novotech way aren't diluted as we grow. I'm based in Singapore, but visit one of our Asia offices every week to ensure that as we grow as a single company, and that the required resources and infrastructure are in place so that we can serve our clients most effectively. Asia accounts for 17% of global clinical trials, with another 2.5% added if you include Australia and New Zealand. Asia, however, does contain 59% of the world's population, meaning that there really is a significant untapped capacity for conducting clinical trials in the region. Asia is the region that has shown the highest overall growth in clinical trial activity, and I'd like to outline a number of the reasons that our clients undertake trials in Asia. First, patient recruitment is highly competitive with, and in some cases superior to the United States, depending on the therapeutic area. This data, which shows the ability to conduct a clinical trial over a 12-month period, or the amount of patients one could expect to recruit for a phase 2 to 3 trial, is taken from Trial Predict. You clearly have access to a large population in Asia, and they are more likely to be treatment naive and less likely to be excluded by conflicts with competing trials. Second, clinical trials provide an important means for patients to access innovative therapies in Asia. In countries such as Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, per capita expenditure on healthcare is more comparable to the West. But in other countries, the ability to access therapies is much more restricted, and both principal investigators and patients are highly motivated to participate in clinical trials. Third, As wealth in Asia increases, disease patterns are mirroring the West. We look at this in detail by country, but as an example here, you can see the disease prevalence by therapeutic area in South Korea versus high-income countries. As you can see, most diseases in South Korea mirror those of wealthy countries, but there are some interesting areas where there are variations in prevalence. And in the example here, South Korea would be a good choice of country when looking at gastric or hepatic cancer. Fourth, sponsors are increasingly interested in Asia Pacific as a consumer market. The OECD predicts that by 2050, Asia Pacific will account for 60% of middle-class consumption, while in the nearer term, IMF sees Asia accounting for 30% of the $1.2 trillion global pharma market. And that's this year. Asia will account for 50% of this year's growth. This consumption pattern, of course, differs markedly by country. And so consumption of original innovative drugs versus branded or unbranded generics accounts for 4% of Indian consumption versus 23% in China and 68% in Taiwan. The fifth reason that sponsors look at Asia is that the costs of conducting clinical trials are on average 30 to 40% lower than the US. And in this exhibit, you can see the costs of a basket of pass-through items that we monitor closely when assessing the cost attractiveness of a country. Sixth, the scale of hospitals and the quality of infrastructure is impressive, particularly in large cities in Asia, where you can see hospitals with up to 2,000 beds or hospital networks that oversee 6,000 to 8,000 beds. The McKinsey Global Institute predicts that by 2025, 310 of the world's top 600 cities will be in Asia, and this metropolitan scale allows the development of large, high-tech hospitals with investment in advanced clinical infrastructure. Finally, and this is a question that comes to us frequently, clinical trial quality is very high in Asia. When we are participating in global trials, we often see the rate of internal quality metrics, such as on-time completion of reports or minor documentation errors, is lower in Asia than in other regions. In terms of FDA data, Asia has a lower rate of official actions indicated or voluntary actions indicated than the United States. I'd now like to introduce Kim Wong, who leads our regulatory team. But before doing so, we have another poll question.
Great. Thank you so much for that, John. And that is correct. We do have another poll question for the audience here, and that should be showing on your screen right now. And the poll question is your company planning to conduct a clinical trial in Asia in the next 1 to 2 years? And if the audience could please get their answers in, and the answers we have today are yes, no, still deciding, and lastly, I don't know. So, is your company planning to conduct a clinical trial in Asia in the next 1 to 2 years? And if the audience could please get their answers in, the poll will be closing shortly. So I will be closing the poll right about now and sharing those answers again with the audience. So it looks like the majority of the audience voted yes with 50%, and 7% of the audience voted no, they are not planning to conduct a clinical trial in Asia in the next 1 to 2 years. 32% voted still deciding, and 11% voted I don't know. So now we will continue on the webinar with Kim Wong.
Hello, everyone. As John has introduced, my name is Kim Wong, and I head up the regulatory operations function here at Novotech. I'm based in Sydney in Australia. Now that you've heard from John about the clinical trials environment and some of the benefits that Asia has to offer, I would now like to take you through the current regulatory environment and what things you'll need to consider from a regulatory point of view when embarking in these Asian countries. Gaining regulatory approvals is one of the first major and essential milestones in conducting clinical trials in any region, so it's no different in Asia. The process and regulations, however, do differ, and every country has their own set of regulations on how they approve their clinical trials. So I'd now like to take you through the current regulatory process and timelines in some of these Asian countries. These are the average timelines based on our own hands-on experience in these countries. They are not necessarily the timelines that are published by the regulators themselves. And we often find that there are other factors outside of the regulatory approval process that need to be taken into consideration. For example, contract negotiation and sign-off can often delay startup timelines in these countries. On this first slide, you'll see Taiwan, Hong Kong, Thailand, and South Korea. With the exception of Thailand, these countries have a parallel review process for ethics and regulatory approvals. For Hong Kong and South Korea, you need to apply for import licenses after regulatory approval. With the exception of Hong Kong, import licenses are also required for medical supplies, things like lab kits and drug administration devices. The overall timelines for these countries is around 4 to 5 months. On this slide, I have Malaysia, Singapore, India, and the Philippines. Again, these countries have a parallel review process for ethics and regulatory approvals. Again, import licenses are required for all these countries. For Malaysia, Singapore, and India, you're looking at startup timelines of around 5 to 6 months. Singapore, you'll notice that the contract negotiation timeline actually exceeds the regulatory approval timelines. So that's an example of what I mentioned earlier about other factors affecting timelines. Philippines has a slightly longer regulatory approval process. Currently, we are experiencing timelines of about 6 months. The published timelines by the Philippines FDA is actually around 3 to 4 months. We are aware of some reform that is currently taking place within the Philippines FDA, so we hope to see these timelines come down at least to the published timelines within the next year or so. Last but not least is China. China is known to have quite a longer regulatory approval process compared to the other countries. Currently, it takes on average about 18 months for approval for a new chemical entity and about 24 months or longer for a biological product. It's important to note, though, that there are several initiatives that are being introduced by the Chinese government to really reduce these timelines. An example of a current initiative introduced by the Chinese government is reducing backlog applications by the end of 2016. Another initiative is to add products to its current fast-track approval process. And overall, they are looking at simplifying the whole regulatory approval process for clinical trials. So I would expect to see that the regulatory approval timeline for China to really come down in the next couple of years. I would now like to share with you a bit of regulatory insight in these countries as well. Again, these are based on our own experience in these countries. As I mentioned earlier, whilst there is a lack of harmonisation of the regulatory approval process in these countries, there is, however, a lot of similarities between the actual applications themselves. So once you have done one submission in one country, it's much quicker and easier to do the subsequent submissions in the other countries. There's more and more harmonisation occurring with the ethics approval process in a lot of these countries. A lot of sites in Taiwan, Malaysia and Singapore, for example, have a central review process. So if you have multiple sites in one country, you can utilise a central ethics review, so it becomes a lot quicker from that point of view. A lot of countries now have country or site templates for contracts. So if you make minimal changes to these contract templates, this significantly reduces the contract negotiation timeframe. The different guidelines can be unclear, particularly when you're dealing with guidelines and applications in different languages. But I think this is where having local and experienced people in those countries is really important for you and will help you to navigate and keep you up to date with the changing regulations as well. If you're planning on marketing these products in these countries in the future, it's important for you to know that some of them require you to have local patient data for registration purposes. So countries like China, Korea, Taiwan and India all require you to have local patient data. So it's essential for you to plan ahead and include these countries in your mix when you're developing your global regulatory strategy. Each country does have a different level of CMC data requirement. So countries like Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore don't require as much CMC data compared to other countries. So if you don't have much CMC data, these are good countries to go to. Again, having an experienced CRO on the ground will be able to advise you on these matters and will be able to advise you whether you have enough data to submit in these countries. Import licenses for drug and devices. These are usually done separately and sometimes can only be done after the regulatory approvals. These are required not only for the investigational product, but also for medical devices and any central lab kits that you use during a trial. So for example, if you have a pre-filled syringe or a nasal spray that needs to be used for the investigational product administration, you'll need to remember to apply for import licenses for these products as well. All these import licenses that you get also need to be maintained, and most licenses are issued on an annual basis, so you will need to remember to renew them during the trial. In addition, if batches or quantities change during the trial, you may also need to update the licenses in some of the countries. Most trials now utilise a central lab, and in some of these countries you need to apply for an export permit to allow you to export the biological samples out of the country. Translation requirements do differ amongst the countries. Countries like Malaysia, Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, require very little translation. Apart from patient-facing documents, all documents are submitted in English and the approvals are also issued in English. Then on the other scale, you have countries like China and Korea where they have quite a large translation requirement. So it's important for you to factor in time at the beginning of your trial for these translations. Translation of clinical trial documents is really a specialist type of translation as well, and not all translation companies can do this well. So it's important to find these specialist translation companies and have experienced people within the CRO who can QC and verify these translations for you. There are also some local cultural things to be aware of as well. In some countries, you actually need to deliver your submission packages in person, and then you'll also need to pick up your approval letters in person. In Malaysia, for example, you need to make an appointment with the regulatory authority to hand in your clinical trial application. Another example is in Singapore, where you actually need to be a Singaporean resident or have a Sing pass to be able to lodge the submissions online with the regulatory authority. What we find works well when you have a study that's run across multiple regions is to have a central regulatory lead person who can really drive, monitor, and track the whole regulatory process for you. This is more of a high-level type role, similar to a project manager, but someone who just deals with the regulatory side of things, and it becomes really important even during the trial when you have updates like protocol amendments, extension of expiry dates, and batch changes, for example, because all these changes require updates to your regulatory submissions. So I hope I've provided you with some tips and regulatory insights into these Asian countries. I'll now like to hand over to Shayanant, who is from our Thailand operations, to take you through the roadmap of planning and getting trials up and running in Asia.
Great, thank you so much for that, Kim. So China, you may begin your presentation whenever you are ready.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, hello everyone. I am Chanon, Critical Operations Manager in charge of Novotech Thailand. Just for information, my time is now about midnight. However, I am very happy to have conversation with you even on the phone. Following my presentation, you may know or learn more on how clinical trial enrollment in Asia is through the roadmap as shown in slide number 21. When we are going to approach the country, what will be involved in our consideration? Even we prefer to approach country with rapid startup, for example, Australia or New Zealand. But most of the time, slow startup countries such as China need to be included. Study sites may also involve introduction of larger populations, but slow startup countries, for example, China, India, and the Philippines. Reputations of key opinion leaders need to take into account as well. Study cost is usually lower priority for our sponsors, but can influence country selection. Potential consuming markets will tend to be the wealthier ones, such as Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea. But China is important from a sheer skill perspective. Sponsors can buy an option on a number of backup countries by commencing the regulatory approval process. Once we have the name of the country list, what is to do next? Of course, to conduct the feasibility. That make us know more about site experience. Many Asia sites are global leaders in their therapeutic area. While most disease patterns in Asia increasingly mirror those of Western countries, sponsors should be aware of particular spikes in prevalence, such as gastric cancer rates in China or Korea. Scale of many hospitals and allows in Asian megacities will allow rapid recruitment. For example, two hospital networks in Seoul have 6,000 beds each. Many key opinion leaders in Asia are global experts in their field, and inclusion will be extremely helpful in a trial program. For example, one of our key opinion leaders in a recent hepatitis study sat on the WHO Technical Advisory Board for the therapeutic area. Completing studies can be an issue in smaller countries in Asia, such as Hong Kong and Singapore, and understandably, but unfortunately, in areas where well-recognized key opinion leaders are in high demand. Idiosyncrasies in standard of care and funding mechanisms can have a huge impact on the trial. Local medical practice can also play favorably into a study. For example, we are conducting a hyaluronic study requiring intratympanic injections. While many principal investigators are reluctant to take patients through this procedure, but this is a very common practice in Thailand. Regulatory advantage. An example here is an orthopedic device study we are undertaking in the Philippines, which was able to start quickly because device studies are not subject to the Philippines FDA approval processes. In Asia, regulatory and contractual processes may occur sequentially or in parallel, as Kim has shown. And sponsors should plan each country taking this into account. Regulators are very willing to engage and learn from Western experiences. As an example, we were able to engage with the regulator in Korea and help them work through an approach to interpreting a controlled substance regulation, which allowed them to approve a study that they were keen to see proceed. Authority of local regulators that does need to be respected. And we have needed to work with sponsors to explain likely delays in closure of a non-compliant site because of the requirement of regulatory approvals you would not see elsewhere. In terms of quality, variable understanding of GCP and informed consent process can be useful to review this at the investor meeting and retrain site staff. Training requirements may be higher than expected, and this is important support functions of the CRA. Early monitoring of new sites should be planned so that retraining can be quickly implemented if issues are identified. In addition, risk management plan, quality assurance plan, and quality control plan per country should be put in place. For legal matters, contract negotiations can be slow in some countries, but in general, these are not litigious societies and negotiations is pragmatic. Novotech has strong interest in standardized contracts, which has been existing in Korea and Thailand for now. Intellectual property protections are in most countries. Hong Kong no longer requires investigational product submission during approval process. China still do, but allegations of product copying seems to have slowed. How about vendor selection? Understand CROs pre-qualify vendors and their vendor approval process, as you can benefit from this due diligence and risk assessments made by high-quality CROs. Regional vendors may be more expensive, but higher likelihood of acceptable quality management system. Sponsors may need to accept compromise with some vendors that they would be less willing to accept in other markets, for example, small local translators. Then, what will be involved in site and investigator selection? CRO relationship with sites and investigators is very important. Early engagement with key opinion leaders and high-profile principal investigators can influence the interest levels of the other sites. Government agencies in some countries can assist with site identification at low cost. Many countries have infrastructure that allows comprehensive, cost-effective patient identification. For example, searchable EMR database across Korean hospital networks. The TB registry in the Philippines with over 1 million records. Clinical Research Malaysia, which is a government-funded organization which will cost-effectively undertake detailed feasibility across all relevant hospitals. Secondary cities can be a rich source of patients with low risk of trial, but additional support may be required. An SMO we work with in China is specifically focused on secondary city coverage. During study conduct, innovative approach to patient recruitment such as social media and adverts targeting can be effective. It seems that Asia has highest rates of internet and handheld device penetration in the world. Countries with more clinical research experience have state-of-the-art processes. For example, EMR's electronic submission of regulatory documents. Processes highly bureaucratic in other countries, such as in Thailand, we generate 15 times as much paper per person as Australia. Expect lower efficiency because professionals are operating in the second language. Expectation hatch series will assist with some work normally undertaken by sites. To understand truly the Asia clinical trial environment, we have to learn and understand Asia people and culture. I am now going to share you some of our experiences with regard to this matter. We found that senior well-connected local leadership is essential for site and principal investigator relationships and regulatory navigation. English language limited in some environments, for example in Thailand, China, Taiwan, and Korea, and so important to access capabilities within the CRO. Staff turnover generally higher than the US and Europe due to scarcity of skilled English-speaking people. Structure of CRO can impact quality and consistency of service. Importance of hierarchy needs to be recognized and has positives and negatives. Country leaders may need to make initial visits to the principal investigator. Principal investigator may require visits rather than email from the CRA. Cultural norms such as saving face need to be considered. Senior staff communication, non-compliance to the PI. During the informed consent obtaining process, discussions held by family, and then questions may be asked by multiple family members. Some interaction between parties unusual by Western standards. For example, CRA buying lunch for study coordinators remains norm in Korea. Modest gift giving in many countries. When we talk about infrastructure in major cities isn't world-class in Asia. Infrastructure may be suboptimal in some areas driven by rapid growth, electricity reliability, internet access. Logistic decisions may be more complex in megacities. For example, investigational product warehousing and transport in Manila, where transport across city may take around 8 hours. Some hospitals may expect sponsor provision of the infrastructure, PC testing equipment, for example. From Novotech side, Novotech has experience with at least top 50 investigators in each country and has experience with at least top 20 sites in each country as well, which is considered about 80% and 92% respectively. Then John will come back and tell you why Asia is for clinical trials. John, please.
thanks, Chai-Anand. Before we address some of the questions that you've submitted, I'll briefly recap some of the key reasons for considering Asia for your clinical trials. First, it's the world's largest patient pool with high enrollment potential, and this is driven by access to patients in countries with low healthcare spend, a high number of treatment-naive patients, and high levels of patient participation and compliance. We've also seen that while disease patterns do tend to follow those patterns in the West, there is some useful diversity for particular therapeutic areas. Asia is an incredibly important future consumer market, and for many of our biotech clients, while this may not be an immediate consideration in terms of their near-term markets, it does create future option value for them when considering much longer-term development and marketing potential. Trial costs are much lower in Asia compared to the US and the EU, although this does tend to be a much lower order consideration for our clients versus the size of the patient pool, which affects speed to market. Asia has incredibly sophisticated infrastructure, particularly in some of the mega cities in Asia. And finally, as we've seen, trial quality is high in Asia with objective evidence from FDA audits across the region. Before moving on to my next slide, we have another poll question.
Thank you, John. That is correct. We do have one last poll question for the audience today. And the poll question is, if planning a study in Asia, what do you consider to be the most compelling reason for doing so? And please, if the audience could select one of the following answers, and the answers are access to greater patient pool to expedite enrollment, or lower costs compared with other regions. And the last answer is good availability of CROs and other service providers. If the audience could please get their answers in, I will repeat the question once more. The question is, if planning a study in Asia, what do you consider to be the most compelling reason for doing so? So I will be closing the poll right about now and sharing those answers with the audience. So majority of the audience, 83%, voted for access to greater patient pool to expedite enrollment. 6% of the audience voted for lower costs compared with other regions, and 11% of the audience voted for good availability of CROs and other service providers. So John, you can go ahead and carry on with your presentation.
Finally, we've summarized a number of the criteria that are important for our sponsors when considering any partnership in Asia. Firstly, sponsors should consider partners with a wide geographic presence, as there are many very different countries in the region with quite different considerations. Partners should have expertise across a full range of study types and therapeutic areas. We believe it's very important that clients should match their own size and strategic objectives with those of a CRO to ensure that both the economic considerations are equal on both sides. Sponsors should have a look at the performance of CROs across all phases and target countries. And as we've seen, a very important consideration is senior in-country management when considering Asia. And this is important in terms of site relationships, KOL and PI relationships, and regulatory relationships. It's also very important that CROs focus on quality people. Does the company provide a one-company service and quality culture sensitive to the local environment? What are the English language capabilities like? Is there rigorous training and evaluation of staff? And is there a focus on office-based and full-time permanent employees? Project managers in Asia should have a high level of multi-country experience. CRO should also have sophisticated quality systems, a flexible service offering, and finally, sophisticated technology that's consistent with the technology of sponsors. That concludes my presentation, and we're now going to move to a Q&A session.
Great, thank you for that, John. And that is right. Right now we will be moving into the question and answer portion of this webinar. I would like to invite our audience to continue to send in their questions or comments right now using the questions window of the Q&A for the Q&A portion of this webinar. And we have already received some questions, so we will begin with those. And the first question we have here is for John. So, Dr. Muller, what startup efficiencies can you suggest to ensure sites can recruit their proposed targets?
Thanks, Vicky. Look, as mentioned in Kim's presentation, it's vital that the full set of required documents are provided to be translated as soon as possible after a study is awarded. In countries such as Taiwan, for example, reducing the need to modify provided CTA templates is essential so that local sign-off can be efficient and not held up with unnecessary legal or financial reviews. Turning around site questions quickly enables local planning to take place so that when the study is fully approved, the SIV is being conducted and screening can commence quickly. Management of vendors to make sure that systems are fully implemented and all applicable training has been provided needs to be carefully managed. Being mindful of time zone differences and setting up multiple training sessions helps to facilitate this. Whether the CRO is managing that or the sponsor, close collaboration between the responsible individuals needs to be closely monitored. As we've heard from Chainon's presentation, it's very important to ensure that the feasibility process is conducted thoroughly and that the right sites are selected, not only because of their recruitment potential, but in assessing which sites have the best PI oversight, support staff resources, and time to conduct the study. By selecting a local CRO that's worked with most of the sites for a long time, the CRO is most likely to be familiar with how local sites operate, and key site staff are known and the site practices are familiar. A well-established rapport and trust with site staff is vital, making sure there's consistency amongst site team, and also respecting the fact that sites are busy, so that knowing the best times of day and days of the week to communicate with the relevant site staff is vital. Frequent communication to ensure important milestones are discussed and sites are kept fully aware of their obligations and the overall status of the study is important. Again, local cultural considerations should be considered. In Korea, for example, a phone call with the PI from the project manager is much better received than emailing out a newsletter. And ensuring that thorough site training is crucial, especially with regard to inclusion and exclusion criteria, so that all sites understand the right type of patients that are required. Pre-screening tools should be provided to enable sites to quickly identify potential patients. And finally, the recruitment needs to be discussed at the site selection visits, investigator meetings, and again at the site initiation visits. And sites need to be involved in their site-specific recruitment plans. Identifying key site staff that have a proven track record of meeting enrollment targets should be encouraged, because what works for some sites may not work for others, and sites need to be fully engaged in what works best for them.
Great, thank you for that, John. And the next question we have here is for Kim. Once you have achieved RA and HREC approvals, what is the next most important task you need to consider?
Okay, thanks, Vicky. I guess the next most important steps are making sure that you have all the documents required for the application of the import licenses, so that these can be submitted as soon as you receive your regulatory approvals. By this stage as well, hopefully you should be well into collecting the essential documents at the site level, so things like CVs and financial disclosures and contract sign-off, etc. The other thing, I guess, is to keep your study sites well informed and discussing potential dates for their site initiation visits. And this is to plan around if there's any local holidays, and you want to make sure that all staff are available for that site initiation visit. And as John mentioned, you really need to keep a close oversight on all the vendors, such as your central labs, IVRS, and your ECRF provider, for example, and even other study equipment suppliers, just to make sure that they're ready to go as well when the sites are ready to go to start the trial. And
Perfect.
I guess just as I mentioned, just as I mentioned before as well, if you have a full service CRO that has experience in this region, that's a pretty good strategy to manage these sorts of things. Thanks, Vicky.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Kim. So the next question we have here is for John. And are there any unique enrollment strategies that you would suggest to help sites meet their enrollment targets that may be more regional specific, and if there is anything we should not do?
Okay, thanks, Vicky. Look, as in any country, plenty of communication with investigators and study teams and occasional motivational visits if required will certainly help to ensure that enrolment targets are met. And there certainly are some regional variations here, which is again why our experienced country team leaders are so important. So some of the differences relate to the structure of the hospital and the clinical trial system in each country. So in countries like Korea and Hong Kong, the clinical trial centres are large, they're sophisticated, they have experienced staff, excellent systems, and they're more able to identify and assist in recruiting appropriate patients. And then there are countries such as Malaysia, where the hospital system is more fragmented, but organisations such as Clinical Trials Malaysia, and this is a government body that's charged with increasing clinical trials in Malaysia, they will interact with a range of smaller sites to achieve a similar outcome to that you see in the larger centres. And then in other countries, the systems are more fragmented still, and so the CROs need to keep in close contact with study coordinators and potentially an SMO to assist with recruitment. In general, as Chynont has mentioned, Asian societies are hierarchical, and there's a great deal of respect accorded to physicians. And so in general, if the principal investigator is engaged, compliance will be high. And so this makes communication with the doctors extremely important. A number of direct-to-patient strategies can also be followed. So for example, we ran some subway advertisements in Seoul that were extremely helpful in our recruitment of an overactive bladder study. And often in Asia, as Chynont has mentioned, direct-to-patient advertising should also be targeted at family members because they have a much larger role to play in health decisions than we'd see in the West. As Chynont also mentioned, internet and mobile penetration is extremely high in Asia, and so depending on the therapeutic area, a number of tools such as targeted Google AdWords may be useful in patient recruitment. So with any of these strategies, there are cultural and religious nuances that our country managers also factor in. So for example, with some treatment modalities would be considered to break a Muslim's fast during Ramadan, while other treatment modalities do not. And so that affects the timing of a trial. In Hindu culture, pain may be seen as an opportunity to progress spiritually, and so recruitment based on a declared pain score can therefore be problematic in these countries. And with direct patient advertising throughout Asia, different colors, different images, different numbers have particular connotations in each country, and so this really does need detailed planning and local understanding before implementation.
Perfect. Thank you for that, John. We do have time for a few more questions here. And the next question is for Kim. How do you ensure you retain your staff?
Okay, thanks, Vicky. We do have a number of strategies to retain our staff. We find that staff retention can be more challenging in Asia purely because of the growth rate in these countries that are so high that this creates a lot of opportunities and competition in these countries. And I guess candidates with a high level of English proficiency are in really high demand in these countries as well. So we do put a lot of effort into ensuring that our compensation and benefits are competitive in each of our countries. And we do this by undertaking staff satisfaction surveys every 6 months just to understand what the market is in these countries. We also have a couple of unique attributes that do make us attractive for potential candidates, I guess. Firstly, as we're an Asian Pacific CRO, all our staff, I guess, have a real prospect of contributing and sitting on the top table in contributing to setting the company's future strategy. Whereas this may feel, I guess, a little bit more remote if you sit in, say, country number 32 of a global CRO. We actively promote regional exposure for our employees as well. We have regional training programs. We have short and long-term office transfers. We also have an ambassador program where a high potential a Novotech employee can spend up to 1 year in any other Novotech office of their choice. We have also structured our CRA roles to be more generalist, so that the CROs work on a trial from start to finish, and this gives the CRA a greater exposure, I guess, to all aspects of the clinical trial process, and not just purely a monitoring role, which can become monotonous over time. And finally, our focus on the biotech sector really provides our staff with highly challenging work sometimes, and this can be attractive for our employees as well. Thanks, Vicky.
Well, thank you very much for those answers. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. However, if you do have any further questions, please direct them to the email addresses showing on your screen. And I would like to thank everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up shortly on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now please join us in thanking our speakers, Dr. John Mahler, Kim Wong, and Chayanant Bunachelio. We hope you have found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone.